Good to see each one this evening. We're continuing our series of lessons begun with the subject of authority itself, and then dealing with some of those areas among our brethren that have caused problems, actions without authority that they need to understand. Most of us have heard lessons on this subject in the past. We need to remind each generation of these principles. Without that, you will see all the gain lost. And we need to hear it again to make sure that we're able to and prepared to teach those when we have opportunities. How do congregations cooperate? Well, if you object to what some are doing, they will say you don't believe in cooperation. As when you object to the kind of music some have, you don't believe in music, or you don't believe in the Old Testament, you don't believe in the Holy Spirit, slanderous charges that are completely inaccurate because you insist on doing it God's way. We need to follow the pattern, and I believe that congregational cooperation is a Bible subject, and yes, congregations can cooperate, but we have to do it God's way, and the New Testament provides the pattern. As Jesus told the apostles in Matthew 18, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. So it's not just what Christ says, but what the apostles say that is bound. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, as I have given orders, and that's a military term, as strong a word as you could find in terms of commands or orders, to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. God expects us to do what the apostles have said. And then Timothy was to turn around and command what he had been taught. These things command and teach. Likewise, 1 Timothy 5, these things command that they may be blameless. So, what Paul wrote to Timothy, what Titus taught to the churches, this is the revelation of God's word, and it's not necessarily in red letters, but it is commanded. We emphasized in the last couple of sessions the all-sufficiency of the local church, that it was sufficient to do everything God gave the church to do. That's the organization, the largest, the smallest, the onlyest organization that you find specified in the New Testament. It's autonomous, that is, it's self-governing, independent of authority from other churches or from synods or councils. It's equal, sufficient to accomplish what God gave the church to do. The passage that really helps bring the point home, that staves off most of the apostasies, is 1 Peter 5:2, which says, the flock which is among you is the extent of their oversight. And that provides, as we pointed out, a brick wall between, so that one doesn't surrender part of its work to another, or the other presume to take over the authority of a, quote, sister congregation. Not a scriptural term, by the way. But they're independent and totally sufficient, with the brick wall in between in terms of authority. They don't kick that down and have one take over the other. The work that's given, and we'll have another lesson following that would emphasize the scope of that work and what is not specifically, but the work of evangelism and edification and benevolence is what the church does. How do we know that? Well, that's what the New Testament church did. That's what they were commanded to do. What else did they do? I don't think they did anything else. There are some who claim that, and we'll look at that later. But that church, that local congregation, is absolutely sufficient in the area of edification, evangelism, benevolence, to do what God gave the church to do. And of course, that's the way it started out, and that was the means by which it was successful. What problems arise? Well, they're no longer confident that that's sufficient. They've got to come up with something else to help out in the area of organization. And that's usually, historically, where apostasy begins, as pyramids lead up to a hierarchical arrangement, gradually, sometimes over hundreds of years, but the fundamental principle, oversee the flock which is among you, specified, excluding beyond that, will prohibit it. Human organizations in the history of the church, especially in the early 1800s, showed a departure from that simple pattern that we find in the New Testament. We needed more efficient organization, according to some of the leaders. And so they formed an organization with a board of directors supplied by representatives from the various churches. And they oversaw and directed the work of edification or evangelism. Eventually, the United Christian Missionary Society took over all of the work that God had given the church. And that battle was fought and largely lost, not by virtue of the logic or reason or scripture, but by virtue of the numbers. Maybe 90% went with what we would call the more liberal viewpoint. They became the Christian church, which today has proceeded so that probably 90% of the Christian church, or at least 85%, acknowledge they're a denomination like any other denomination. They just left the idea of the Lord's church being restored, which is how they started. It began as they began to use human organizations to oversee and direct the work of the church. After that battle was won, the church purged, started over. Then we see it beginning again as brethren used an emotional issue as a wedge to accomplish basically the same thing over again in the area of benevolence and brotherhood orphan homes with emotional appeals. We talked about the emotional appeals of those promoting the missionary society. Just burn those churches down. Let souls perish for lack of the gospel, which was not, of course, the issue at all. Everybody wants the gospel to be preached, but you do it with God's organization, not man's. God's organization is sufficient. That's the issue they shifted. And now then, it's all about the heartless people that don't believe and take care of orphans. And with that appeal, they got another human organization, churches supporting the board of directors, which then oversees the work. That split the church again, and we're living today in the midst of that divide with churches of Christ just across the expressway here that believe this is the way to do the Lord's work. And the idea of being limited to the local congregation in accomplishing evangelism and edification and benevolence is ignored. We believe that local congregation, referred to as the whole church by Paul, writing to the church of Corinth, when the whole church comes together, it is a complete entity in itself, the local congregation. That's it. Now, if we understand that, and that the extent of authority is limited to the flock which is among you, then we solve all those problems. And we go back to the efficient way that the church evangelized the world in about 30 years. Well, the charge is you don't believe in cooperation. And the question is, can churches scripturally cooperate? And I think the answer is definitely yes. But we have to follow the Lord's pattern. And when we look at the pattern, it becomes obvious that the pattern in evangelism is not the same as the pattern in benevolence when churches in the New Testament cooperate. Why would there be a difference in the pattern about how the churches can cooperate in evangelism? And is there a difference, fundamental difference in those two works? I think the answer is definitely yes. And what would the difference be? What? Okay, benevolence has a temporary element that you hope to relieve. What else? What's the limit of our responsibility to preach the gospel? Not any our ability, our opportunity. It's a worldwide responsibility. What about our benevolent responsibilities? Limited again by our ability, but the church wasn't intended to be a worldwide benevolent organization, was it? That's not its purpose. Now, a lot of people don't know that.
Yes. An important point to make regarding that too is if God intended for the church to be a worldwide benevolent organization, we failed miserably. God does not assign a local organization or his local group more than they can accomplish in the obedience to his will.
Red Cross is just beating the socks off of us. And it's equipped to do a lot better job. It never was intended for that purpose. There are limited scopes of that authority, but it does have responsibility, and we need to fulfill what we do have, but it's not like benevolent. That is not like evangelism, which is worldwide and unlimited in responsibility. Just preliminarily, as we look at the two issues, we would expect there to be a difference. What's the pattern for churches cooperating in evangelism? Can they cooperate in evangelism? I think the answer is absolutely yes. When we look at the New Testament, we see they did, and that's the way we need to do it. In Philippians chapter 4, even in Thessalonica, now who's he writing to here? Church in Philippi, right? And Paul was in Thessalonica. You sent more than once for my needs. They were helping the evangelist preach the gospel in Philippi. So the pattern here, the Philippian church sent directly to the evangelist, not to the bishop, not to the diocese, not to the sponsoring church, but you said to me, Paul said. That's pretty simple. Well, that's not efficient in the minds of a lot of people because you got to have some big organizations, which usually is not that efficient. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, I robbed other churches, and we have a lesson coming up where we'll talk more about why Paul would use such unusual language. Why would he rob churches? Taking wages. Wages are that which is due. It's a debt. We see that the wages of sin is death, same terminology. It is that which is due as a result of the labor, but it's due from the one who is the beneficiary of the labor, right? we understand that as employees. And he wasn't taking wages from the one where he was laboring there at Corinth because of the false teachers who were slanderously accusing him. And so instead of that which was owed by the church at Corinth, he received money from other churches which didn't owe. And so in that sense, robbed other churches taking wages from them to minister to you there at Corinth. And so here we have other churches sending to the church at Corinth. That's not what he said, is it? He received wages. He was sent money from other churches. And they bound themselves together, and they had the archbishop oversee. Nothing like that in there, is it? Equal, autonomous, independent, sufficient congregation sent directly to Paul. That's just as simple as it can be, and that's what you see when it comes to cooperation with churches in evangelism. But of course, that doesn't work very well, does it? They preached the gospel in 30 years, Paul said, to all creation. I think that worked pretty well. A lot better than what we're doing today, even with the internet and other advantages. But there were no boards of directors or any other organizations between the churches and the evangelists. It's just church sent to Paul. Simple enough. But anytime you get it simple and it's not all piled up and making a big show, it doesn't satisfy pride and people that want to do big things in big ways. We do big things in big ways when it comes to preaching the gospel. That's great. And I appreciate that desire to really do a great job. But we're not going to improve on God's wisdom, His methodology. And this is it. And you may think another one will do better. Like Moses might have thought, boy, if we had a big steeple on that tabernacle, or if we had a kitchen there to help wash some of those utensils, you could imagine all kinds of things that would really help that God forbade by saying, you do it according to the pattern. And today we are the house of God, the church is, and the church is to do that which is according to the pattern. We're not talking about buildings, we're talking about the church, which is parallel to the tabernacle, the house of God today, the church, and it is limited by the pattern. Principle that's just run roughshod over by many of our brethren. But the local church is sufficient, just as it was in terms of boards of directors, in terms of evangelism. That's it. But we have people who say, well, this sponsoring church has better elders, and they have more ability. If we just pile it all together and let them oversee it, it'll work better. Did you ever see anything like that in the New Testament? Paul received wages from other churches. Did I see it?
Well, just the thought in that, which I'm sure you're going to pick up with, is how inefficient organizations that function that way become. We know that in our society, we see it. When you get a call from a benevolent organization and someone's soliciting money, you should know that it will be probably 60% will go to the organization collecting the money to pay salaries, and 40% will go to someone that might actually receive the service.
They usually don't mention that when they're appealing, but that most of us understand.
Well, when we lobby for individuals with disabilities to receive direct support services, you would not believe the resistance we receive from large large organizations that have their home office and all of their salaries paid from the monies that would go to provide the services. And it's hard to find local services. It's an inefficient operation and one of the least effective because where the money never trickles down to finally the person that needs it the most when you always see what was going to get directly to them.
My wife is an educator. My degree is doctorate in education. We see that so dramatically in education. Most educational organizations in the state educational organizations, are so top-heavy. About 60% are managers, about 40% are teachers.
And the system cannot be adjusted because the people that make the decisions are the ones getting the 60%. It would mean that they would have to write themselves out.
I had a friend of mine who was writing a book on that to make that point, of course, objecting to the inefficient way that we try to educate kids. And he was comparing, and this was the state organization in Texas, which was 60-40, 40% teachers. 60% people telling teachers what to do. And in his research, he was comparing it with the Catholic churches, who, ironically, having, in view of the fact they've built the hierarchy to run the church that's not in the scripture. In education, they understood that point and have simplified it so that it makes the state organization look ridiculous. He just decided to call the Catholic headquarters for the church there in Texas, and that's a pretty good size educational effort through the Catholics. And he called the headquarters and just said, now, how many teachers do you have in Texas? And I think it was like 3,000 in the Catholic schools in Texas. Well, how many executives do you have over those teachers? And the fellow said, well, they're all here at this building. Well, how many? Well, he said, let me count. 1, 2, 3. We got 18 with 3,000 teachers. And it's working like a charm. Well, that doesn't prove what's scriptural or not, but I thought he made his point very well.
I know it doesn't prove it, but the argument when the 90% went with the sponsoring was thinking is a more efficient way.
And those who were purged from that thinking, who just went with the New Testament plan, outgrew them 10 to 1 in the next 30 years. So it went from 10-90 to better than 50-50 within 30 years. So that is interesting. It's no more than that. That doesn't prove anything. What proves the point is what's scriptural. But it helps to see points like that. We need to resist the impact of letting that help us make the decision. That's not how we make the decision, but it's interesting. The sponsoring church is the way to do evangelism with the majority of churches of Christ today. And that's really sad. Depending on what part of the country you're in. There are parts of the country where that's not the case, but generally that has been. I've spent a good bit of time in the Birmingham area and in the Dallas area when the division over institutionalism and sponsoring church came. in Birmingham, where my father was, who was moderator of the first debate among the brethren, moderated for Brother Roy Cogwell. They won the battle. Of the 53 churches in the Birmingham area, 2 of them went with the liberals. The rest of them took a stand for the truth. In Dallas, it was the opposite. There were about 2, maybe 3 that stood for the truth. The rest of them. History is interesting. It doesn't prove points, but it maybe gives us some insight.
Well, the significance is that everyone in this room understands how that is now another. The instrument is the new thing.
Yeah.
Instrumental music, well, with women, but.
And when you destroy the need for authority, which they did here, then the gates open and the rest of it follows.
That's what's next. And
Yeah.
what we're reading and seeing here and what happened will be another struggle.
The point that we have here on the chart at the bottom tells us the nature of the pattern, which ought to be impressive. When we understand you have to make all things according to the pattern. One church never sent to another church for evangelism.
It protected the local church. See, if one church sends to the other church, just like the gentleman that I was sharing some time with, who was a Presbyterian preacher, in that sponsoring type operation, the people that send him money also send him the lesson of what he had to teach for Sunday. And lost local control.
If the churches are completely equal with regard to the responsibility of preaching the gospel, why does one church turn the funds over to another? There's a fundamental difference in the work being done, and it's different from benevolence, where there is a local need peculiar to one congregation. That's not the case with the work of preaching the gospel. There is no peculiar to one congregation obligation there. It's worldwide for everybody. And so you never see that. I think we can understand clearly why the pattern is different. Yes, in benevolence, one church sent, but never in evangelism. Well, did not one church want to do more, or maybe had better elders or more? Probably, but it didn't happen. And pattern is specific, which excludes alternatives. There's no sponsoring church. It's just one church sent to another church. Now, several churches may sent to a preacher, never to another church. But several churches may support the preacher, as Paul affirmed. But that's it. That's the pattern in evangelism. And as a result, Paul in Colossians 1 said the gospel, which you've heard, was proclaimed in all creation under heaven. Now, you may not believe that, but that's what Paul said, and I think it's pretty serious to disbelieve it. It worked. This was 30 years after they began preaching the gospel, so approximately. The unscriptural cooperation developed one of the most influential and first, and served as sort of a wedge and pattern for the rest of the sponsoring churches, was the Herald of Truth, the Highland Elders in Abilene, Texas. And they solicited money from hundreds of churches who sent them money so they could preach the gospel to the world. They had a TV program. That's not something we think is unscriptural, is it? We can have a TV program. We're not against that. And if you could have a bigger one, that's good. But when you have one church overseeing the work for everybody else. You just send them your money and we will evangelize. You have a pattern that's different, and it's just like the Missionary Society, the United Christian Missionary Society. When churches are no longer independent and autonomous, equal, here you have a super church where churches turn their funds over to one to do the work of evangelism.
Man,
Yes.
inserting in that moment, what do you think that Highland Church has, what issues have they pressed forward within the last 20, 30 years?
You name it. And you're probably right.
One of the leaders of here in Little Rock came out of it, went down there and came out. It's instrumental music. It didn't stop, with this radio program and teaching. It's instrumental music. It's the role of the church, leading aggressive behavior, and
Promoting for
but now
hospitals.
you have very wealthy elders.
Yeah.
Because all these churches are sending money. If you flip that around a little bit, it would look like the papacy.
Yep.
It would look like Catholicism.
If you make it up and down instead of sideways, yes. But that was the wedge. And the appeal, let's preach the gospel to the world. Here's the most efficient way to do it. Send it to the Highland elders and let them oversee it. Well, who's going to be against preaching the gospel? Well, but that's not what we opposed. We were accused of being against cooperation, and against preaching the gospel to the world. Now, let me just add something that I think needs to be stuck in here. That's a different point that pains me. I've worked with some of these brethren, sometimes in efforts to teach on faith where we agree, though they have accepted evolution at Highland completely. And at Abilene, that's taught as fact. I'm getting off the point. The fervor, the force, the power behind this era was a fervent desire to preach the gospel. Back up historically and see the context. This was right after World War II. And a lot of brethren had been in the armed forces and had been around the world and saw and made friends with those people all over that didn't have the gospel. And they came back home from the various countries in Europe and they said, we need to reach these people. These are our friends and they're lost without the gospel. And brethren responded with this kind of organization. There should have been a different kind of, but I acknowledge that motivation is what was behind it. And I look at that fervor, misguided as it is, and compare it with our own. And we say, oh, we're for preaching the gospel, but you compare what they are doing with what we're not doing. Yes, we're doing, but I'm sorry, I see a difference. I think we need to have the kind of fervor and determination to preach the gospel that I can sometimes see in these misguided efforts. Some of you heard me talk about the church where I did teach on evolution. About a 600-member church. They were actually opposed to institutions to do the work of the church, or at least said so. They were involved in cooperative efforts, but they weren't receiving. Well, It was a pretty unusual group. Considerable, I guess, is the term we sometimes use. They were involved in some sponsoring church arrangements. But for the most part, they did their own. Fifth Sunday contributions went 100% to preach the gospel around the world. And they raised, the average contribution was about $6,000 per Sunday for 600 members. But about 70 to 75, their goal was 75,000 for the fifth Sunday. That's a lot of money. And you don't get that without people really, really wanting to preach the gospel. I don't see that very often. I don't see that among my brethren that often. But they're working at it. God bless them for working at it, I wish. And I think we did have some influence there. So when we say, oh, we believe in preaching the gospel, and they say, you're anti-preaching the gospel. That's not true, but some of that stings because there is an element of truth. Maybe some think I ought not to say that, but that's what I see. I think we need more conviction, more concern about souls lost around the world. We need to do more sacrificing to accomplish that. Think of Israel that was more interested in their own homes than in building the house of God as they came back from exile, and the scathing rebukes of the prophets because of it. I think I see some similarities, and I see it more when I get in amongst them. They are after it and putting us to shame in some areas. Doesn't justify doing it unscripturally. Okay, with that off my chest, let me proceed with the lesson. The main point, 1 Peter 5:2, elders oversee the flock. Exercise the oversight among you. And that will stop it. Now, Dennis brought up the point of the inefficiency of departing from that pattern. You can't improve on God's pattern. Remember, the judges were God's pattern for organization, and they wanted a king. Well, God gave it to them, and of course it's a matter of judgment how to, at that point. God then said, I'll show you how dumb this idea is. And when you just back off and look what developed, it wasn't just the herald truth. It just blossomed and went in all directions. Dad moderated for Brother Harold Dowdy, the gospel preacher. This was 25 years ago. And the debate was conducted in Jacksonville, Florida. And Brother Harold Dowdy was defending the truth. And at that point, he did a lot of research about what was happening among those who believed in the sponsoring churches. And just the picture of what he documented at that point is probably worse today. But it was every point well documented then. Beginning with the Highland Church in Abilene, Texas, with churches from all over the country sending to the Highland Church. Okay, that's what they were debating about. But that's not what happened in the years to come. They would send money to the Gunter home, the board of directors, to oversee and direct benevolence. It wasn't overseen by the Highland Elders. Now, here's money being sent for the Highland Elders to oversee, but they say, no, we're going to let the board of directors oversee this. They also sent to Wacoa, Oklahoma to preach. Well, we've got the scripture for that, but now wait a minute, how did those dollars get there? They had to come from up here to down here to down there. That's not scripture. That money wasn't necessarily Highland Elders' money. That was money from churches all over the country. And likewise in Portland, Indiana, and in Augusta, Maine, well, they're helping churches, but they are the sponsoring church. That is, you send me the money and we will take care of preaching the gospel. That's not the scriptural pattern. The contributing churches are no longer overseeing all of the work of that flock among them, and Highland Elders are overseeing more than that flock among them. It's just extra machinery between the church and the work. But they also send money to the Broadway Church in Lubbock, which itself is a sponsoring church. So here's the church up here that sends money to the Highland Church, who then sends it to the Broadway Church, which has its own children's home, and it does oversee that. And they have a German fund so that they send money to Germany to take care of benevolence there, as well as preaching the gospel, and a Bible chair with its own board of directors, which didn't come from the Highland Church exactly, kind of did, but then it came from hundreds of other churches originally. And then there's hundreds of other churches that are sending to the Broadway Church to help them do the work that they're doing. And so here's the dollar that comes here, and then it comes, it's going back and forth. They then send to the East Side Church in Lubbock to preach the gospel. So here's the church up top gives to the Highland Church. They send to the Broadway Church. They send to the Lubbock Church. And then some of the money from Broadway that they collect from the other churches goes back to Highland to help preach with Herald Truth. So there's dollars going like this in between. They get counted about 14 times before it gets to spend.
I don't understand, Don. If I'm a smaller church and I'm giving to Highland or I'm giving to Broadway, I'm going to give you money as an investor. I want something in return. What do those smaller churches get in return?
Nothing. They just turn their funds over and let the better elders do it, the super elders.
You get a newsletter with pictures of what your money has done in benevolence.
It's not like a publishing company where you publish literature or you pay for a particular TV program to be sent out. It's you send it to us and we'll oversee the work of preaching in Portland, Indiana, Augusta. If we decide that's not a good idea, we'll send it somewhere. But we make all the decisions in Highland and send some of it down here to Lubbock, which turns around and sends some of it back.
So if that church that I'm with falls on some hard times, we can't send the money that we normally send. Would Highland or Broadway?
They'll send somebody down there and pound on it.
Straighten us out.
Oh yeah, they've got recruiters all over. Dad started preaching not too well in Lubbock, Texas, and the church where he was wanted him to go out and be one of the recruiters, and he put up with that about as long as he could and just got out. Started preaching in Alabama. Just he was in the middle of this being developed and saw it happen. And of course, the East Side and Lubbock Church, which gets money from Broadway and Lubbock, some of which may have come from the church at the top here, turns around and sends it to Idlewood, Texas. So it's about 3 steps to get there, and it then sends money to Italy to sponsor the work in Italy. And so here's the church up top sending to Highland, sending to Lubbock, back to Highland, then to East Side, then to Idlewood, then to Italy. And that dollar gets counted at least 10 times before it gets spent. And of course it piles up, and ooh, look at all the work that's being done. They also send to the Manhattan Church, which sends to the work in Germany, a sponsoring church. So that's 3 sponsoring churches swapping dollars. And then the Pioneer Park Church in Lubbock receives money from the Lubbock, the Broadway Church, which in turn sends to Las Vegas and Mexico. Then there's the Central Church in Houston with its Home for the Ages. It receives money from all kinds of congregations and also sends it to Highland. Instead of the churches sending to Highland, they send to Central, which sends to Highland, which sends to Broadway, which sends it back to Highland. They send money also to Monterey and to Trinidad. But now this is the picture. That's a long ways from what you see in the New Testament, isn't it? To say inefficient with a vengeance. But when you open the door to do it any way you want to do it, rather than following the pattern, this is where it goes. And guess who's getting more preaching done? Somebody just sends money to the preacher. It works better. That's God's plan. And in the New Testament, one church never sent to another church for evangelism. And how in the world do they say they're following the pattern? Those dollars are going back and forth in all directions. This is God's pattern. All right, that's evangelism. We'll talk about benevolence, Lord willing, next time, which is different, but very clearly specified as to how it is to be done. And we'll look at the pattern in the New Testament and compare it with what's being done.